The air in the ballroom smelled like money. That particular blend of white roses, chilled champagne, and the quiet desperation of people performing wealth they were only half sure they still had. I noticed it the moment I walked in, not because I was sensitive to such things, because I had spent the last 4 years learning exactly how to read a room. My name does not matter yet. What matters is the table. Table 17, pushed against the far wall near the catering station, partially obscured by a floor-length curtain that someone had arranged, not by accident, to block the sight lines from the main floor. The tablecloth was the same ivory as the rest, but the centerpiece was smaller. The chairs were the folding kind, not the cushioned Chiavari chairs that lined every other table in the room. And the people seated there were the ones my mother had categorized, over years of careful social architecture, as the ones who did not quite fit the picture she was trying to paint. The event coordinator, 2 cousins from my father's side who had not gone to the right schools, a family friend who had lost his restaurant during the pandemic, and me. My mother had walked me to the table herself. She had done it with a smile. That particular compressed smile she reserved for moments when she needed to communicate something without saying it aloud. She had touched my elbow, guided me past the round tables with their clusters of laughing guests, past the bar where my stepfather's business partners were already on their second scotch, past the head table where my half-sister Daniela sat in $42,000 worth of dress, glowing under custom lighting that the wedding planner had positioned specifically to make her look like a portrait. "You'll be comfortable here," my mother had said, and then she had turned and walked back toward the light. I sat down. I set my clutch on the table. I accepted a glass of water from a server who did not make eye contact, and I looked out at the room, and I thought, not for the first time, and not with particular bitterness, that I had been sitting at table 17 my entire life. The difference was that tonight, I had brought documents. Let me tell you about the distance between Daniela and me, because it is not the distance you might assume. We are not strangers. We grew up in the same house, shared the same hallways, ate at the same dinner table for 14 years. The distance between us is not one of absence. It is one of architecture, carefully constructed, strategically maintained, invisible to anyone who did not know where to look. Daniela is my mother's daughter from her first marriage. I am my mother's daughter from a brief and apparently embarrassing entanglement with a man named Rodrigo Vasquez, who died when I was 3 and left behind, according to my mother, nothing of consequence. I believed that for a very long time. My mother remarried when I was 5. Gerald Whitmore, Gerald with his firm handshake and his membership at 3 different clubs, and his talent for making every room feel like a boardroom. Gerald had a daughter of his own, 2 years older than me, from a previous marriage that nobody discussed. But Gerald's daughter lived with her mother and visited on holidays, so the domestic calculus was relatively simple. My mother and Gerald, Daniela and me, all under one roof in a house in Connecticut that cost more than most people made in a decade. And Daniela was the son of that household. I want to be precise about this because I am not interested in performing victimhood. Facts are facts, and the fact was that Daniela was beautiful in the way that registers immediately, that lands before a single word is spoken. She was warm and social and genuinely funny, and she had my mother's gift for making people feel chosen. I do not say this with resentment. I say it because it is true, and because it matters to understanding what came later. What also mattered was that Daniela was not especially interested in school. She was not cruel about it. She did not mock people who cared about academics. She simply moved through education the way someone moves through a room they have no particular need to remember. Grades were fine. Attendance was fine. But the hunger was not there. The obsession was not there. The obsession was mine. I was the quiet one. I was the one who stayed at the table after dinner with books stacked next to the breadbasket, who asked teachers follow-up questions, who chose her electives based on what was hardest rather than what was easiest. I was the one who got into MIT at 17 with a partial scholarship and a note from my mathematics professor that my mother read once, set down on the kitchen counter, and never mentioned again. I went to MIT on loans. Gerald and my mother paid for Daniela's degree at a private arts college in Virginia in full, without discussion, because it was simply what was done. I graduated with honors and $46,000 in debt. That is not a complaint. It is a coordinate. It tells you where I started. I spent the 4 years after MIT working in financial forensic consulting. The work sounds dry. It is anything but. What I did essentially was find things that had been hidden. In balance sheets, in corporate filings, in trusts and estate documents, and the gaps between what was declared and what was real. I was very good at it. I was so good at it that by the time I was 27, I had been recruited by a firm in New York that handled cases large enough to be referenced in law school curricula. I did not attend Daniela's engagement party. I was in London, testifying as an expert witness in a fraud case involving a mid-size investment bank. I sent a gift. My mother texted me a photo of the gift still in its box, positioned at the edge of a table with no message attached. I understood the message. When the wedding invitation arrived, I almost did not RSVP. I sat with it for 3 days. I thought about what it would feel like to walk into that room, to watch my family perform love and unity for 500 guests, to smile and eat the salmon and pretend that table 17 was just a table. And then I thought about something else. 6 weeks before the invitation arrived, I had received a letter. It came to my apartment in New York, forwarded twice, originally addressed to a woman named Clara Vasquez at an address in New Mexico I did not recognize. The return address was a law office in Albuquerque. The envelope had been opened and resealed, not perfectly, in a way that told me someone had read it and made a decision and then reconsidered. Inside was a 1-page summary from an estate attorney, informing Clara Vasquez. Informing me because Clara Vasquez was the name on my original birth certificate, the name my father had registered before my mother legally changed it after his death. That the estate of Rodrigo Vasquez had been restructured following the death of his business partner, and that certain assets previously held in trust were now accessible for disbursement to named beneficiaries. I had been named. I called the attorney the next morning. Her name was Patricia Okonkwo, and she was precise and patient, and she had clearly dealt with situations like mine before. She told me that my father, Rodrigo Vasquez, had been a co-founder of a small technology company in New Mexico in the early 1990s, that the company had filed several patents, that those patents, largely dormant for years, had been licensed to a larger technology firm in 2019 and then again in 2022. That the royalties from those licenses had been accumulating in a trust. That the trust had a named beneficiary. Me, my mother had known. Patricia Okonkwo confirmed it with the careful neutrality of someone who understood that what she was describing was not her jurisdiction. There had been correspondence. There had been a previous notification sent when I turned 18 that had been responded to, not by me. The response, written on paper with my name signed at the bottom in handwriting that was not mine, had declined further contact and waived the right to information about the trust. I sat very still when she told me that. 18. I had been in my first semester at MIT. My mother had been managing my mail. The amount in the trust, as of the most recent statement, was not enormous. It was not generational wealth, but it was $412,000, and it had my name on it, and it had existed my entire adult life while I took out loans and worked 80-hour weeks and sat at table 17. I RSVP'd to the wedding. The weeks between that phone call and the wedding were the most focused weeks of my professional life, and I have spent entire years of my professional life doing nothing but focusing. I requested documents. Patricia Okonkwo sent originals by courier, copies by encrypted file transfer, and a timeline that she had organized with an attention to detail I genuinely respected. I cross-referenced dates. I pulled my own financial records. I requested, through legal channels, copies of the correspondence that had been sent in my name, correspondence I had never written. The signature was close. It was not mine, but it was close. The kind of close that works when nobody is looking, when the expectation is compliance and the question has already been decided before it is asked. I sent the documents to a handwriting analyst. She confirmed what I already knew. I also made 2 phone calls. The first was to my father's surviving sister, an aunt I had not spoken to since I was 4 years old, a woman named Lucia who had tried to maintain contact after my father's death and had been, gradually and systematically, made impossible. Lucia cried for most of our first conversation. She told me things about my father I had never known, that he was gentle and precise, and that he had loved puzzles, that he had been fiercely proud of his work, that he had spoken about me in the months before his death with the specific intensity of someone who understood that time was short and love was not abstract. She also told me that my mother had received a settlement at the time of my father's death, a settlement that included, as a condition, my mother's agreement to inform me of my inheritance rights when I turned 18. The second call was to a colleague, a family law attorney named James Chen, who had helped me structure several expert witness agreements and who now spent 30 minutes on the phone with me laying out, in precise terms, exactly what had occurred and what the legal implications were. The word he used, carefully and more than once, was fraud. I wrote everything down. I organized it the way I organized every case, chronologically, with source documentation, with annotations that cross-referenced each claim to the evidence that supported it. I created a folder, a physical one, because there is something about paper that a digital file cannot replicate in certain rooms. I had the documents notarized. I made copies. I put the copies in a fireproof case in my apartment, and I put the originals in the folder, and I put the folder in my bag, and I flew to Connecticut for my half-sister's wedding. The ceremony was at 4. I arrived at 3:30, having driven from the hotel where I was staying, not at the family house, a decision my mother had framed as practical and I had accepted without comment. The venue was an estate in Westport, the kind of place that existed primarily to be photographed, all stone walls and manicured gardens, and a ballroom that had been rented for the entire weekend at a cost I knew because Gerald had mentioned it at Christmas, in the particular way that wealthy people mention prices, not boastfully, but with the careful offhandedness of someone marking territory. The ceremony was beautiful. I will not pretend otherwise. Daniela was radiant in the way she had always been radiant, a warmth that operated on some frequency independent of context. And her groom, his name was Thomas Beckett, 34, an architect from Boston with kind eyes and an easy posture, looked at her with the straightforward, uncomplicated love that I had stopped expecting to witness and was now simply glad existed somewhere in the world. I sat in the third row from the back. During the vows, my mother caught my eye from the front and gave me the compressed smile and then looked away. At the reception, I found table 17. I sat with the event coordinator, a woman named Priya who was there in a professional capacity, but had apparently been given a seat rather than a staff station, which was either a kind gesture or an oversight. I sat with Marcus, my father's nephew from his second marriage, whom I had met exactly once before, and who turned out to be a high school chemistry teacher with a dry sense of humor and an encyclopedic knowledge of Connecticut zoning law for reasons he did not fully explain. I sat with a woman named Ruth who had been my mother's college roommate and who existed in a social limbo I recognized. Too old a friend to exclude, too inconvenient to fully integrate. We talked. The food was excellent. I had not expected to enjoy the food, but it was genuinely excellent. A seared sea bass with a lemon butter that was so precisely calibrated it was almost aggressive. Marcus told a story about a zoning dispute that was genuinely funny. Priya showed me photographs of a wedding she had coordinated in Tuscany that had involved a runaway goat and an Italian mayor and resolved somehow into the most beautiful table arrangement I had ever seen. I was almost calm. And then the DJ cut the music. Not the way music usually cuts at a reception. The gradual fade, the MC stepping to the microphone with practiced joviality. This was abrupt. One moment the room was full of sound and the next it was not. And in the sudden acoustic space, I heard Thomas Beckett's voice from the center of the dance floor say, "Can someone turn the lights up? Please, can someone turn the lights up?" The lights came up. Thomas was standing in the middle of the floor, his jacket slightly open, a glass of champagne in his hand that he set down carefully on the nearest table, as if he needed both hands free. He was looking across the room, at me. I had met Thomas Beckett precisely twice before this evening. Once at a family dinner 18 months ago when I'd flown in for Gerald's birthday and Thomas had been there as Daniela's new boyfriend, and we had spoken for perhaps 12 minutes about urban planning and the specific challenges of adaptive reuse in historic buildings. He had been thoughtful and specific, and he had listened in the way that people who are genuinely curious about the world listen, not waiting for his turn to speak, but actually absorbing what was said. Once at Christmas, a briefer encounter, A conversation that had lasted perhaps 7 minutes because my mother had rerouted it. He was looking at me now with an expression I recognized from the cases I worked. It was the expression of someone who has just understood something they should have understood earlier. He walked across the dance floor. The room was not silent. 500 people generated a low, ambient hum, even in surprise. But it was quiet enough that his footsteps registered. Daniela was at the head table, and I watched her face move through confusion into something more complex. My mother was 3 tables from me, and I saw her set down her wine glass with the precise, controlled motion of someone preventing themselves from doing something else. Thomas stopped at table 17. He looked at me and he said, "You're Elena, Daniela's sister." "Half-sister," I said. Old reflex. He shook his head slightly as if the distinction was not what he meant. "She told me you work in financial forensics. In New York." "I do." He pulled out the empty chair beside me, one of the folding ones, and sat down. The room was doing what rooms do when something unexpected happens. Redistributing attention, whispering, recalibrating. My mother was very still. Thomas said quietly, "I need to tell you something, and I should have said it before tonight, but I didn't know how, and now I think I was wrong to wait." I looked at him carefully. In my work, I had learned to read people quickly and completely, and what I was reading in Thomas Beckett at that moment was not drama. It was not performance. It was a man trying to correct something. He said, "Your mother came to me 6 weeks ago. She asked me. She said it would be better for the family dynamic if you and I didn't have much contact. She said that you had certain," he paused, chose the word with visible care, "tendencies toward disruption. She said that you had a history of making things difficult at family events." I did not say anything. "She told me that you were coming tonight only because it would look strange if you didn't, and that the best approach was to keep the evening moving so there wasn't much opportunity for—" She didn't finish the sentence. "She asked me to make sure you were seated somewhere comfortable but away from the main event." Thomas looked at table 17. He looked at the folding chairs. He looked at the curtain and the catering station. "I didn't ask enough questions," he said. "I should have. I'm asking them now." At the head table, Daniela had risen from her chair. What happened next is something I have thought about many times since, trying to identify the exact moment when the evening shifted from something personal into something irrevocable. I think it was when Daniela reached the edge of the dance floor and called out, not loudly, but in the clear, projected way of someone who had always been heard in rooms. "Thomas, what is happening?" And Thomas turned to her and said, "Come here, I want to talk to both of you." My mother was moving. I saw it in my peripheral vision, that controlled, purposeful movement she used when she needed to intercept something. Gerald was half risen from his chair. The DJ was standing with one hand on his equipment looking at the event coordinator, who was looking at me. I made a decision. I reached into my clutch. I took out my phone and I set it on the table, recording. Not because I plan to use it, or not only because I plan to use it, but because I have learned that the presence of documentation changes the texture of a conversation in ways that matter. And then I opened the folder. Daniela reached us. Up close, she was flushed and bewildered and still somehow beautiful in the way that had always been effortless for her. She looked at Thomas and then at me, and then at the folder on the table. "What is this?" she said. "Sit down," Thomas said. He was not unkind, he was precise. She sat. Her dress made it complicated, and she managed it with the automatic grace of someone who had worn difficult dresses before. My mother arrived. "This is not," she began. "Mom." My voice was not loud. I had spent years learning to deliver information in a register that was calm enough to be heard over almost anything. "Please sit down." The word mom, in that context, the deliberate factual use of it, the refusal of the diminutive and the refusal of the formal distance, silenced her the way I had known it would. She sat in the chair that Marcus quietly vacated for her because Marcus turned out to be exactly the kind of person who reads a room correctly. The 5 nearest tables had gone entirely quiet. Beyond them, the hum continued. But we were in a bubble now, a self-contained acoustic space, and everyone within it was paying attention. I put the first document on the table. It was the letter from Patricia Okonkwo's office, the summary of the trust. The names, the amounts, the dates. I said, "This is a letter from an estate attorney in Albuquerque, New Mexico. It describes a trust established by my father, Rodrigo Vasquez, before his death in 1994. The trust names me as the sole beneficiary. As of this year, it contains $412,000. My mother's expression did not change the way people's expressions change when they are surprised. It changed the way they change when they have been waiting. I put the second document on the table. This is a timeline prepared by the same attorney of correspondence related to the trust. It includes a notification sent to my mother's address when I turned 18, a notification she received, and the response sent from that address declining further contact and waiving my right to information. Daniela was looking at the documents. She was not looking at my mother. I noticed this and I thought it told me something about what she had known or suspected, though I was careful not to assume. This, I continued, placing the third document, is the analysis from a certified handwriting examiner, comparing the signature on the response letter to samples of my handwriting collected from school records, loan applications, and employment forms. Her conclusion, which she will provide as sworn testimony if necessary, is that the signatures are inconsistent. Silence. Not the silence of shock exactly. The silence of comprehension, of people doing the arithmetic in their heads and arriving at an answer they had not predicted and now could not ignore. Thomas was looking at my mother. His expression had moved into something that I recognized but could not fully name. The specific combination of restraint and anger that belongs to people who take being deceived very personally because they have tried very hard to be honest. "Eleanor," he said. His voice was quiet. He used my mother's name with none of the warmth that had always characterized his interactions with her. The warmth she had probably mistaken for pliability. "Did you sign Elena's name on a legal document?" My mother did something then that I had not predicted in all my preparation. She looked at me. She looked at me directly, not at Thomas, not at Daniela, not at the documents on the table. And what was in her expression was not guilt exactly, and it was not defiance. It was something more complicated and in some ways more devastating. It was the look of someone who has been operating for so long under a set of beliefs about the world that the falseness of those beliefs has become invisible to them. She had believed, I think, that she was managing, that she was protecting something, the family, the image, the careful arrangement she had built. She had believed that my father's money was a problem to be solved rather than a fact to be reckoned with. She had believed that I was not nothing, but that I was a component that could be arranged, positioned, redirected, and that this was not cruelty but pragmatism. The compressed smile came, and then it dissolved, and she said, "You don't understand how difficult it was." I said, "Tell me." It was not an invitation. It was a sentence that contained everything that had not been said in 32 years and offered the space, finally, for it to be said. Not because I expected her to take it, but because I wanted every person at that table to understand that I had offered it. She did not take it. Gerald put his hand on her arm and said something quietly, and she straightened and looked away, and the moment closed. Daniela asked to speak to me privately. We went through a side door into a corridor that smelled like stone and old wood and the faint trace of catering carts. She was still in the dress. I was still holding the folder. We stood in the hallway like two people who had arrived at the same destination by entirely different routes. She said, "I didn't know about the trust." I looked at her. "I know." "I knew?" She stopped. Started again. "I knew that Mom treated you differently. I told myself you were difficult, that you made it harder than it needed to be. I believed that because it was easier." "Yes," I said. "That was wrong of me." "Yes," I said again. She was crying now, not dramatically, not the kind of crying that asks for comfort, but the dry, specific crying of someone processing something that has been sitting at the edge of their awareness for a long time and has finally been allowed to fully land. I watched her, and I felt something I had not expected to feel that evening, which was a kind of sorrow, not for myself, but for her, for the particular limitation of having been the son in a system that was more unjust than you had allowed yourself to see, and having to understand that now in a hallway, in your wedding dress. I'm not asking you to fix this tonight, I said. I'm not asking you to do anything tonight. She looked at me. Tonight is your wedding, I said. It should be your wedding. And I meant it. I had not come here to destroy her evening. I had come here to stop being managed. We went back inside. What followed was not a scene. I want to be accurate about this because the tendency in stories like this is to dramatize resolution, to give it shape and music and catharsis. What followed was people returning to their champagne, the DJ cautiously restarting the music, a low-level hum of conversation that had a different frequency now, charged, circulating, redistributing information in the social osmosis that happens when something real has occurred in a room full of people who are very good at performing normality. My mother and Gerald left within the hour. I watched them go. My mother did not look at me on her way out. Gerald looked at me once with an expression I could not fully read. Not quite apology, not quite acknowledgement, but something between them, something human and insufficient. Thomas found me at table 17 before he went back to his responsibilities as a groom. He sat down for 2 minutes and he said, "I'm glad you came." I said, "I am too." He said, "I want you to know that what happens with Daniela's relationship with your mother, that's going to be Daniela's decision. I'm not going to push her toward anything. But I want you to know that our house is not going to operate the way that—" He stopped, found the right words. "The way this evening was supposed to operate." I said, "I understand." He left. He danced with Daniela. She laughed at something he said, genuinely laughed, the full laugh she had always had. And I sat at table 17 and watched them and thought about my father, whom I had never known, who had registered my name on a document with his own hands, who had made sure that there was something waiting for me even from beyond everything that had tried to intervene. Patricia Okonkwo filed the formal petition the following Tuesday. The legal process took 11 months. I will not describe all 11 months, because the truth is that legal processes are mostly waiting, paperwork, and the specific endurance required to trust a system that moves according to its own rhythms rather than yours. What I can tell you is that the handwriting analyst's report was admitted. What I can tell you is that my mother's attorney attempted 3 separate negotiation approaches, the last of which involved a figure that was significantly larger than the trust amount, and which I declined because the point had never been the money. What I can tell you is that the final resolution involved a full disbursement of the trust assets, a formal acknowledgement recorded in the legal proceedings, and a civil finding that the 2001 correspondence had been submitted without the consent of the named party. The money went to 4 places: a portion to Patricia Okonkwo's fee, which was worth every cent; a portion to a scholarship fund I established in my father's name at the University of New Mexico for first-generation students in STEM fields; a portion to Lucia, my father's sister, who had kept trying to reach me for 30 years; and a portion I kept, not as a statement, not as a symbol, but as the practical acknowledgement that money is not dirty just because someone tried to prevent you from having it. My mother called me 9 months after the wedding. It was a Sunday afternoon and I was in my apartment in New York doing something entirely ordinary, making coffee, possibly, or reading. She called, and when I answered, she said my name, and then she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I don't know how to do this." I said, "I know." She said, "I convinced myself that I was protecting you from something complicated, that the money would confuse things, that it was better to—" She stopped. I waited. "I convinced myself," she said again, differently, more slowly, as if hearing for the first time how the sentence ended. I said, "I believe you." She was quiet. "I believe that you believed that," I said. "That doesn't change what happened." We spoke for 20 minutes. It was not reconciliation. It was not the beginning of reconciliation, at least not in the way that word usually implies. Some returned to a before that had not actually existed. It was something more accurate than that. It was 2 people locating each other in the space that remained after the architecture had been removed. I told her I would not be available for Christmas. I told her I might be available for something smaller at some point, on terms I would define. She said that was fair. She did not argue, and the absence of argument was itself a kind of information. The first honest communication we had had in 32 years. I want to talk about Daniela," because she is not a peripheral figure in this story, even though it might seem that way, and because what happened between us afterward is the part of the story that I return to most often. She called me 6 weeks after the wedding from what sounded like an airport. She was direct in the way that people are direct, when they have been preparing what to say and have decided to simply say it. She told me she had spoken to a therapist. She told me she had spoken to Thomas. She told me she had decided to significantly reduce contact with our mother for a period of time. Not as punishment, she was careful about this distinction, but because she needed to understand what she actually thought and felt about things without the constant input of someone who had a very specific interest in how she thought and felt. She said, "I want to know you. I don't know if we can be sisters in any real way given everything. But I want to try, and I want to try without pretending any of it didn't happen." I said, "That's the only way I know how to do things." She laughed. It was not the full laugh. It was smaller, more tentative. But it was real. She said, "Yeah, Thomas said that about you." "What did Thomas say?" "He said you were the most precise person he'd ever met, and that he meant it as a compliment." I thought about this. "I'll take it," I said. "We have met 3 times since then. Twice in New York and once in Boston. The meetings are not easy. There's too much history and too much silence where history should be, and we are both people who have learned to operate with significant self-sufficiency, which makes the project of genuine closeness technically possible but not automatic. But there is something there, some actual substance beneath the family performance that we had both been living. We are finding it carefully the way you find a structural wall in a renovation, tapping, testing, trying to locate what actually holds weight. I want to tell you what I think about sometimes when I'm on a plane or walking through the financial district on a clear morning, when the light comes in low and specific the way it does in early autumn, and the city feels like a problem that has been beautifully arranged. I think about the version of me that did not get that letter. The version who never received the forwarded envelope from Albuquerque, who never called Patricia Okonkwo, who went to the wedding and sat at table 17 and flew back to New York and continued operating within the architecture that had been built around her without ever having a structural drawing of the building. I think about how long I could have continued that way. I think the answer is indefinitely, because the human capacity to adapt to conditions we did not choose is enormous and mostly involuntary, and sometimes, in its enormous quiet endurance, becomes indistinguishable from acceptance. I think about what my father put in that trust and why. Whether it was about the money, which was real and which mattered, or whether it was about something else. Whether he understood, in whatever way a dying man can understand the future, that a child who inherits something is a child who is claimed, that the act of placing her name on a document and making it legal and real and surviving his own death is a form of presence that persists beyond presence. That it was not about the $412,000, but about the fact that somewhere in a law office in Albuquerque, in a file that nobody had managed to fully erase, my name was written by someone who loved me. I think about that, and I think about Patricia Okonkwo's patience and Lucia's 30 years of trying, and Marcus and his inexplicable knowledge of zoning law, and Priya and her Tuscan goat and the sea base with the lemon butter that was genuinely one of the best things I ate that year. I think about Thomas Beckett walking across a dance floor at his own wedding, because something felt wrong, and he had decided not to wait any longer to say so. And I think the architecture was everywhere. The architecture was so pervasive and so long-standing that I had stopped being able to fully see it. It took a letter and a forwarded envelope, and a phone call, and a folder, and a table by a catering station, and a man who paid attention. It took all of that to make visible what had always been there. I am 32 years old. I have a 6-figure salary, a 1-bedroom apartment in Tribeca that I chose because the light is good and the building is structurally interesting, and a case file on my desk involving a family trust in Arizona that has been generating discrepancies for 7 years. The discrepancies are, as they almost always are, not accidents. I have a scholarship fund named for a man I never knew, who loved puzzles and believed in careful work, and wrote my name down with his own hands before he ran out of time. I have a sister I am learning. I have an aunt named Lucia, who sends me photographs of New Mexico landscapes and calls on Sundays with the particular persistent warmth of someone who has been practicing love across distance for 30 years and is not going to stop now. I have a mother who exists in my life at a careful distance. Not absent, not present in the way that presence usually implies, but real. She is real and I am real, and what exists between us is real, even if it does not look like what either of us would have chosen. And I have something else. Something I did not expect to have at the end of this. Something that the professional efficiency of my training had not fully prepared me for. I have the knowledge that I went to that room, that I sat at that table at the far end near the catering station in a folding chair, and I opened my folder and I spoke in a clear and measured voice and I said, "This happened, and here is the evidence, and it stops now." Not because it would change everything, not because the past could be recalculated or the years could be restored, or the signature that was not mine could be unwritten, but because the decision to be quiet about true things, to arrange yourself around the architecture rather than to name the architecture, is a decision that compounds. It costs more every year, and the cost is paid in something more precious than money, though it took me a long time to understand what that something was. It is paid in the belief that your presence in a room is justified, that your name on a document means something, that you do not need to earn the right to be at the table. I sat at table 17. I opened the folder. And I did not earn the right to be there. I already had it. I always had it. It just took 32 years, a letter from Albuquerque, and one man walking across a dance floor to make that fact impossible to ignore. The rest, as they say, is documentation.